After World War II ended, America became a place of prosperity and hope. Veterans bought homes in the suburbs for no down payment if they kept a job and promised to pay off the house. The economy flourished, leading to the baby boom. Although prosperity grew, fear crept into the minds of Americans. During this time, Kathy Yeomans was born on the west side of Michigan. Throughout her life, she encountered the fear of communism, segregation, and turmoil throughout the nation. In response, Kathy Yeomans protested for what she believed in. Protests like these sparked change in America. At a young age, Kathy Yeomans witnessed the hatred and secrecy of communism. During her years in elementary school, the McCarthy hearings took place in Congress. She witnessed Senator Joseph McCarthy ruthlessly trying to find and prosecute hidden communists. This mentality was pervasive. For example, Kathy Yeomans' father, Stanley John Gorney, and a couple of other worried parents were in charge of checking textbooks for subversive ideas.
I remember my dad paying a lot of attention. I was a kid, so it was more or less what I heard from him. And he was on a committee at my school to check history books and social studies books for signs of communist sympathizing. And according to them, they found some. I know some of our textbooks were changed at the time.
Even books Miss Yeomans wanted to read, such as The Maltese Falcon by Dashiell Hammett, were taken away. During this tense time period, many people were convicted of having communist ideals. On a national level, in the McCarthy hearings, people were being tried for communist loyalties. Owen Lattimore, the former editor for the Institute of Pacific Relations Journal, was one of these. He was working closely with Chiang Kai-shek, who was the former president of the Republic of China, prior to the Civil War, with non-communist China being defeated in 1950. With Lattimore's views in association with Chiang Kai-shek, McCarthy targeted him as the #1 spy for the Soviets. After being interrogated for 12 days, Owen Lattimore was convicted of 7 counts of perjury. 3 years later, the charges were dropped and his reputation was destroyed.
There was a lot of suspicion. There was fear of communism, fear that the communist way of thinking was creeping into our society. So there was we were always on guard as to whether our teachers were communist leaning or our books were too communist leaning, were the movies leaning towards communism.
When Miss Yeomans attended junior college, her father banned her from taking specific classes such as history out of fear of the teachers being communist.
Like my dad, when I first started at junior college, he would not let me take political science or social studies or history classes. He forbid it because he thought that most of those teachers were communist leaning.
One of the classes she did take, art, focused on architecture. While out one day studying a building for class with her partner George, an African-American man, they stopped at a coffee shop. This introduced Miss Yeomans to another conflict, discrimination in America.
When I was at CC, I took an art class, and we were mostly focused on architecture in this class. And it was a 3-hour-long class, and you had to have a partner, and we would go into the downtown area and sketch buildings. And my partner was an African-American boy. And he and I had been downtown sketching, and we decided to break for lunch. And we went to a department store. It's where the police station is now, I believe. It was the old Herbolsheimer's. And they had a coffee shop down in the basement. And a lunch counter. And we went and sat at the lunch counter. And sat and sat. And finally realized that they were deliberately ignoring us. And they weren't going to serve us. So we just quietly got up and were prepared to leave, and I told him I think I wanted to use the bathroom. And I got into the bathroom, and some woman came and pounded on the door and just called me all sorts of swear words for being with this African American. And it was such a shock. It was the first time it hit me that, yeah, we have discrimination here in town.
When she was at the Civic Auditorium protesting, she had the opportunity to shake hands with Martin Luther King Jr.
He was very gracious. Back in those days, we'd get a notice in the paper when someone was coming to town, and they always pulled up in front of the Civic Auditorium, and so you knew when he was coming in.
Even in the North, African Americans suffered from segregation and discrimination. At the end of World War I, the KKK began to grow exponentially in the North. In 1925, 50,000 Klan members marched in Washington, D.C., protesting the reconstruction of the black communities and persons in the nation. Members of the KKK burned crosses in their victims' yards and hung African Americans from trees. They would also bomb African Americans and supporters of their views. In the North, because of the decision Brown v. Board of Education, in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional, many blacks started attending college. They also tried to move into better neighborhoods, but realtors were told to block this, forcing African Americans to remain in poorer neighborhoods. In 1968, the Fair House Act was established to end housing discrimination. It didn't eliminate discrimination then, and housing discrimination continues to exist today. The article, Residential Segregation After the Fair Housing Act, states that we have almost twice as many complaints as we did in 1999. In 1999, there were 5,872 housing discrimination complaints. In 2009, that number grew to 10,552. However, in 1958, 44% of whites said they would move if a black family became their next-door neighbor. Today, the figure is 1%. As Miss Yeomans encountered discrimination, she participated in protesting against these injustices.
We had signs that said, "Hell no, we won't go." We had signs that said, "How many kids did you kill today?" We had a lot of protest songs that were really great back then. And if you get a chance, you should look some of those up. The Eve of Destruction.
The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting?
Not only was there discrimination against blacks during the 1960s, there was also discrimination against gays. Kathy Yeomans saw signs referring to gays, stated in the article Protest in 1969 that the movement tried to end traditional biases and laws against homosexuals. This resulted in the Stonewall riots. This started in 1969 after police raided a gay nightclub with justification that the club was selling liquor without a license. Protesters soon broke out into the streets of New York City throwing glass bottles. The Stonewall riots continued throughout New York City, which led to the formation of Gay Liberation Front. These protests began a culture of protest music. Songs such as The Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire were played on the fairly new 1954 innovation, the transistor radio. The transistor radio was the first battery-powered portable form of music. This was important because people could bring their music to protests, listening to music such as the song Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, a popular anti-war song. Music allowed protesters to spread their attitudes towards injustice.
The one that I remember the most was transistor radios. And when I was a kid, the radios were these big, huge boxes. And when they came up with the transistor radio, you could get a radio this big, or you could get radios about the size of your smartphones. And they came in little leather cases, and they did have earbuds. And that was so cool. And most kids, if you were a teenager, you walked around with your phone pressed to your ear. And I remember wanting one so bad, which I think I got as a freshman in high school.
In the 1950s, the fear of communism permeated our country, and in the 1960s, discrimination and frustration with war added to the mood. The protests and riots of 1960s and 70s were a response to these frustrations, leading to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At that time, only 18% of whites claimed to have a friend who was black. Today, 86% say they do, while 87% of blacks assert they have white friends. Protesting has paved the road to a better tomorrow.